This is 5 O'Clock Shadow on the Pacifica Radio Network. I'm Robert Knight in New York. And there are multiple events regarding human rights in Libya unfolding even as we speak. Overnight, human rights official Navi Pillay at the United Nations addressed the Security Council on the continuing detentions and tortures and non-judicial treatment of prisoners and stated explicitly that there was an element of racial discrimination in the operations of the militias and other institutions inside Libya today. And the global human rights organization Amnesty International released a major report called Libya, Deaths of Detainees and Widespread Torture. The opening paragraph of that reads as follows. Several detainees have died after being subjected to torture in Libya in recent weeks and months amid widespread torture and ill treatment of suspected pro-al-Gaddafi fighters and loyalists. Delegates have met detainees who showed visible marks indicating torture inflicted in recent days and weeks. Their injuries included open wounds on the chest, limbs, back, and other parts of the body. We are now joined live by Sanjeev Bery, Amnesty International's Advocacy Director for Middle East and North Africa. Welcome, Sanjeev. This is quite a stunning report. What are the major points of it?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. Amnesty International definitely appreciates the opportunity to share these very challenging and brutal facts that have been derived from our mission in Libya. The broad outlines are that we still have a situation in Libya in which potentially very large numbers of people are being held in a diverse patchwork of detention centers controlled by local militias, and that many may be subjected to torture and repeated acts of torture and brutality as part of their ongoing detention. It's a broad challenge that has emerged in the aftermath of the decades under Gaddafi's repressive rule, that now you have this chaotic environment where you have so many different detention centers and militias that are conducting torture and grabbing people off the streets in some cases, targeting people based on alleged loyalties to Gaddafi, based on skin color in some cases, and subjecting them to quite cruel punishments.
The report says that detainees, both Libyan and foreign nationals from sub-Saharan African countries, told Amnesty that they had been suspended in contorted positions, beaten for hours with whips, cables, plastic hoses, metal chains, and bars and wooden sticks, and given electric shocks with live wires and taser-like electroshock weapons. What do we know about the demographics of those who are being subjected to this as far as has been able to be determined? I'm hearing many reports that there is a racial element and that people who are of apparent African aspect are particularly vulnerable to these activities, even if they are Afro-Libyans and citizens of Libya.
That is indeed accurate. There were, during the Libyan conflict, widely overly exaggerated rumors that Gaddafi had hired a large number of mercenaries from outside of Libya, or darker-skinned Libyans or sub-Saharan Africans in his conflict with rebel forces. And that wildly exaggerated rumor has intersected with pre-existing racism and xenophobia to make many darker-skinned Libyans, as well as black Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, whatever the terminology is that one wants to use, the subject of these sorts of abductions, of torture, of unfair detention that never ends, in which the detainees don't have the opportunity to talk to a lawyer, to find out why they are detained, or in some cases to see the light of day.
Have you learned anything about the geographic distribution of these abuses? There being tripartite cultural division in what was once a unified nation of Libya, with the Cyrenaicans to the east, the Tripolitanians to the west, and the more Afrogenetic part of the country in the south. Is there any kind of geographic pattern that is evident yet?
Well, one of the challenges with this situation is that precisely because there isn't a centralized authority that is exerting its will and sending a clear message to these diverse militias and detention centers, the result of that is it is difficult to have hard and specific numbers with regards to geographic distribution, with regards to the ethnicity or demographics of the people who are being held. There are certainly signs that people who are affiliated with tribes that were considered to be, quote-unquote, more loyal to Gaddafi, or in the regions where Gaddafi's troops are being subjected to discriminatory practices, torture, and in some cases even in-custody deaths. But the big problem is that because it's such a chaotic environment, and because the NTC, the new government authorities in Libya, are not doing enough to centralize the control of the detention centers, it's difficult to answer the question you just asked.
One of the hotspots of which we are aware is in the area near Sirte, Tripoli, Misrata, and Tawarga, which was largely black enclave, a remnant of the slave trading days when that was a staging ground for that activity. And the militias from there apparently caused to disappear or caused to flee some tens of thousands of people who are facing all kinds of racist slogans and death threats and impromptu lynchings. And the militia in that region has said that the town of Tawarga will not ever live again, that it will be called the new Misrata. Do you suspect that possibly racism and violence is being used for the annexing of land?
We don't have a definitive statement to make on that. I mean, it's clear that racism and violence are definitely intersecting and are definitely at play. As to what the specific motives are of specific militia leaders in different local areas, it's difficult to say what the motives might be, whether it's a question of maintaining power or using that power to acquire assets or resources. That's not part of this current report with that kind of granular detail. Broadly speaking, it's safe to say that in an environment where there is not accountability, you are going to have all kinds of political actors using force, using the barrel of a gun to exert their local will. And that's why in an environment of impunity, which is the environment that many Libyans find themselves living in right now, authorities and localized power figures are able to do what they want. That's why we're having these allegations of torture emerge. That's why we're having situations where Amnesty International researchers who have been on mission in Libya are meeting people who are literally showing them their open wounds, in some cases hours after having been tortured. In other cases, Amnesty International is having interactions or has had interactions with Libyans who are afraid to speak for fear of additional torture, but will simply show them where on their body the torture happened. These kinds of things are all a product of an environment of impunity where the NTC authorities, difficult as their job is in this chaotic environment, where the NTC authorities have not done nearly enough to start building a political culture where if you do something wrong, regardless of who you are and what your loyalties are, you're going to be investigated. That's the first step. The second step is to make sure that every single person in Libya who is detained today has access to doctors, has access to medical care, and certainly has access to a lawyer. None of these basic standards are being met right now, and you potentially have thousands of people living in these circumstances in detention centers or jails, quite frankly, across the country.
Can you share with us some of the incidents that your teams witnessed, or the nature of torture or death that has been encountered?
Sure. One example, the relatives of a former police officer and father of two from a town east of Tripoli told Amnesty International that the father, the former police officer, had been detained by a local armed militia in October of last year, and that they hadn't been able to obtain any information about his fate for 3 weeks. And then they received a call where he was allowed to call his wife. And then a few days later, his family was informed by a hospital in Tripoli that his body had been brought in. And that body reveals deep bruising all over the body and limbs, open wounds, all kinds of grotesque and clear signs of torture. And this is just one example of a number of situations where Amnesty International has confirmed deaths that have occurred with what are very obvious signs of torture from people who were detained or held or who had been disappeared.
The range of wounds, is it primarily brute force, blunt trauma, or cuttings or fractures? Or have you witnessed any sign of more sophisticated instruments in the exercise of torture?
My impression, based on what my colleagues who were on the Libya mission are sharing with us, is that it's not this a sophisticated kind that where you might have a central government that is deploying, tools and technology. But there are still, significant signs of a range of torture practices. Torture, wounds that have been inflicted all over the body, the use of whips, cables. I think you might have mentioned some of this at the beginning of this section of your show. Whips, cables, plastic hoses, electroshock weapons, a grotesque diversity of ways in which local militias and authorities have used violence in their interrogations and in their treatment of detainees.
We're speaking with Sanjeev Bery, the Advocacy Director for Middle East and North African Affairs of Amnesty International. And Sanjeev, witnessing also carries its hazards and risks. Can you tell us how the Amnesty team went about its work? Were there any jeopardies that were faced, and how was this coordinated? And how did you get access, and how forthcoming were the victims?
Well, unfortunately, I know this is a very interesting question, and it would be a very interesting answer, but the details of how we go about, both ensuring the safety of our colleagues as well as access on the ground sometimes involves confidential information, access to friendly networks, and an evaluation process so that we can make sure that the information we then provide to the broader global public is, in fact, as accurate as possible. But I can't really go into too much detail without, violating some of the confidentialities that are involved with getting our researchers on the ground and giving them access to detention centers and getting them from point A to point B safely.
Understood and appreciated. The director of the action in Libya, Donatella Rovera, says we're not aware of any proper investigations into cases of torture, and neither the survivors or relatives of those who have died in detention have had any recourse to justice or redress for what they have suffered. What is the level of death in proportion to the torture?
The level of death?
Yes. How many deaths are you aware of, and how common is that in the course of these detentions?
That again is another one of those pieces of information that is difficult to speak to definitively in an environment of impunity and in an environment of these localized authorities. Amnesty International has directly confirmed a number of deaths through the interviews that my colleagues have conducted and the information they have gathered, but it is extraordinarily difficult to speak definitively in numerical terms because there are so many different detention centers and so many different militias on the ground.
The issue of the non-responsiveness of the transitional regime in Libya is being characterized as frustrating by a number of human rights activists and people of concern. Why do you think there is no real motion on ending these behaviors?
There are probably a lot of different reasons for that. This is what you could call a chaotic or a post-revolution environment in which the central authority has not, is still quite shaky and is still dealing with a lot of different dispersed authority figures in different parts of Libya and in different communities. To its credit, in mid to late 2011, the NTC transitional authorities did issue a constitutional declaration enshrining some of the basic principles around international human rights and international humanitarian law. But today, on the ground, what you just said is accurate. There is a climate of impunity. There's no accountability. If you've lost a loved one or a loved one has disappeared in Libya or in your local community, there's no place for you to go. And as some of the reporting has indicated, police are even afraid to accompany victims or family members of victims because there are so many weapons floating around, and in some cases the police themselves are afraid if they aren't directly connected to the local militia authorities. And that is the big problem here. But even with this immensely difficult task, there are still some very basic things that the NTC can move towards doing that Amnesty International would like to see the Libyan authorities do, and they haven't yet taken these steps.